Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I rise to bring to an end this debate that we have had here today on this very important and critical bill entitled Covid-19 Prevention and Control Bill 2020. I'd want first to thank the Honourable Member for number 7, Prime Minister, for his kind words in thanking not just myself, but my staff who have spent many sleepless nights, weekends here embedded in government headquarters, especially when there was a lockdown. The Parliamentary Council would spend hours here crafting regulations under the Emergency Powers Act. We have done a number of them, a number of iterations. And it's important to make that comment because those regulations are what some members of this House have referred to as patchwork, just regulations cupped together. But they are the foundation of the legislation that will govern St. Kitts and Nevis over the next months as we continue to cope with the response to COVID-19 pandemic here in St. Kitts and Nevis. I should point out that those regulations are not created by the Attorney General's chambers. We have had to meet, sometimes virtually, sometimes in person, with the Chief Medical Officer and her team. You would note that in the COVID bill, there's reference to the HEOC, which is the Health Emergency Operating Center. And that Emergency Operating Center, as defined in the bill, speaks to medical fraternity, medical experts here in St. Kitts, as well as those in Nevis, who would meet regularly every morning at 9 o'clock during that early days, and still continue to meet in helping to determine the nature, give the expert advice as to how the health tools, the non-pharmaceutical tools that we have needed to be able to manage this pandemic, which form part of this bill. I want to thank Madam Deputy Speaker, all those who have made a contribution here today to this bill, this debate. I would want to thank first the member for number 3, Minister of Health, the Honourable Byron for her sage words and her contribution as she seconded the bill and made a very valuable and important intervention in the debate. I'd also want to thank as well my co-chair in the National Disaster Mitigation Council, the Honourable Senator Wendy Phipps on this side, who has been a very valuable support at the Mitigation Council. It's just over the weekend we were musing at the fact that almost every day we spend hours having to meet with various members of the task force, attend meetings with a number of stakeholders across this country, whether it be the Chamber of Industry and Commerce, whether it be hoteliers, whether it be a variety of stakeholders, to be able to understand the challenges that they have, to see in what way we can work to mitigate any difficulties they may have had. And of course, when I speak of that, I cannot but speak to the team, who I'll come to a little later, at the National Task Force. But today, we have to thank all the members who spoke. I think that we spoke to the member for number 2, made a very important contribution, and of course, you yourself, Madam Deputy Speaker, you were very powerful today, very much on point, and you played some blows, really. Yeah. I want to thank the members opposite as well, because it is critical that the House, the Parliament, as well as the country, get to understand what they themselves, interacting with their constituents, what they would have understood and what they have brought to the floor of this honorable House. They've asked a number of questions, all of them, and I hope that in the brief remarks I have in closing, I'll be able to respond adequately in answering those questions that they have raised. The first question that I want to respond to, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the question of the Chief Medical Officer. I did not quite understand what that was about. And I think all of the members opposite have raised the issue of the Chief Medical Officer. And it seemed to me that there was a concern over a particular clause in the bill that bothered them. So I hope you don't mind, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I respond, I go back to what it is, seem to be of an interest, of a bother. And it's really clause 24 of the bill that speaks to the CMO may make emergency orders. That, I think, was what started it. And if I can just read the section, it says, subsection 1, when, in the opinion of the Chief Medical Officer, a COVID-19 emergency exists, so the Chief Medical Officer has to have an opinion that an emergency exists. The Chief Medical Officer may, not shall, but may, by order, direct special measures to be taken during the continuance of that emergency for the purpose of this Act, and any such order shall have effect notwithstanding anything to the contrary in any regulation or rules enforced by virtue of those sections. As an important phrase, and I read it out because I think in responding it's important for the benefit of those opposite who raised it, that they understand what is being said. Subsection 2 of that order, though, is very, very important. And we heard a lot that members on this side had not been reading the bill. And when you read subsection 2, you wonder if that stopped at subsection 1 and didn't read subsection 2. Because subsection 2 says, an order made under subsection 1, and that is by the Chief Medical Officer, may be varied. Varied can be changed, amended, or rescinded, can be gotten rid of by order of the minister. Because that was what the criticism was. The CMO seemed to have more power than the minister. And going to make regulations, running things. And right here, the same section, you just read down one subsection, an order may be made under subsection 1 by the Chief Medical Officer, may be varied or rescinded by the minister. And I was very much taken aback by that, because I couldn't quite understand what the criticism was that bothered members. But I would not stop there, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the benefit of this House to look at other sections. Because there was a reference to the Public Health Act. And so I have with me, Madam Deputy Speaker, a copy of the Public Health Act, Chapter 9.21 of the laws of St. Kitts and Nevis. This Public Health Act Act number 22 of 1969 came into force on the 1st of December 1970. It was amended 3 times, the last time being Act 5 of 2001. And I want to go quickly to a particular section, and that is, and this Public Health Act, of course, states that it is an act to make provision for the law relating to the public health and to provide for related or incidental matters. Why the Public Health Act is referred to here? Because if you look at Chapter 1, Part 1, Preliminary of the Covid-19 Prevention and Control Bill 2020, and you look at Part 1, it speaks to, in Clause 2, an interpretation, Chief Medical Officer means the Chief Medical Officer appointed pursuant to Section 7 and 8 of the Public Health Act, Cap 9.21. So the bill here goes back to the Public Health Act. That's why the Chief Medical Officer is critical in this whole fight and arrangement for the COVID bill. And if we went to Public Health Act at, they say here, Section 7 and 8 of the Act, maybe we should have a look at them because they can be instructive to help us. Section 7 speaks to, of the Public Health Act, that is, appointment of public health officers. They shall be appointed, and 7 said, they shall be appointed in a manner authorized by law for the purposes of this Act, a Chief Medical Officer for the state, as well as such medical officers of health, community health nurses, environmental health officers, and other public health officers may from time to time be required for the administration of this Act and the regulations. And then 8, subsection 8, has as its subhead, delegation of ministers' authority to officers. And subsection 1 says, except as the minister may otherwise direct, the Chief Medical Officer is authorized to carry out, exercise, and perform the duties, powers, and functions conferred on the minister under this Act. So I just wanted, for the benefit of the member for number 1 in particular who raised this, that in the Public Health Act, that you could look to Section 7 and 8, where it gives to the Chief Medical Officer the authority, as does the minister, to carry out the functions related to questions, the powers and functions under this Act may be required by the minister or the chief medical officer, and in so doing shall be deemed to act under the authority thereof. The House can carry out, exercise, and perform the duties, powers, and functions conferred on the minister. But I don't want to end there, because this seemed to have been a big point being made that somehow this COVID bill we are doing somehow violated this whole protocol and so on related to the Chief Medical Officer. And I want to turn to the Quarantine Act. The Quarantine Act, and this is Chapter 9.23 of the laws of St. Kitts and Nevis. The Quarantine Act was first introduced into St. Kitts and Nevis, Act number 25 of 1944. It came into force on the 26th of July 1946, and it too had been amended 3 times, the last time being under the Act number 9 of 1986. And I wanted very quickly just to say what it is. The Quarantine Act is an act to make provision for the imposition of quarantine measures in order to protect public health, and in that connection to establish a quarantine authority and to provide for related or incidental matters. Section 3 of the Acts establishing the quarantine authority. For the purposes of the Act, there shall be a quarantine authority in the state. And here subsection 2 says, the quarantine authority in the state shall be the chief medical officer, not the minister. The chief medical officer has the authority to exercise quarantine provisions in the country. So that when we speak on the COVID bill about the chief medical officer being in that position of having that authority, it comes from the Quarantine Act, it comes from the Public Health Act. It's not being made up or anything frivolous. The chief medical officer is deemed the #1 medical expert in our country. She advises the government. She has that authority. And during the course of this year, our chief medical officer has shown our country that she has worked exceptionally hard and properly. And the country has gotten the confidence, is in the confidence, the chief medical has the confidence in this country, because she has worked tireless hours to ensure that she has given us proper advice, expert advice, without fear or favor. And the country, and I would want to join all those others who do so in commending Dr. Hazel Laws for the excellent and outstanding work she has done in the country in a proper manner. I thought I should just mention that. I could go on as well and look at subsection 4. Health officers and visiting officers shall, in the exercise of their powers and the performance of their duties under this Act, act under the general or special direction and control of the Quarantine Authority, and the Quarantine Authority is the CMO, Dr. Hazel Laws. So that I'm happy that the member for number 6 was made the point that he's not challenging our authority, but I just wanted to say, because the question had been asked, and I hope it has been answered properly and professionally. This bill, Madam Deputy Speaker, has taken a lot of months to come together. And there has been this question about why now? Why take so late? And I think the Honourable Member for number 7 has properly answered that, in that it could not be in April. We did not know where we were going, what was going to happen. And there were a number of iterations of the regulations that were set out under the Emergency Powers Act, starting in, I think it was SRNO number 7 and 9, and I could count them. They reached up to SRNO number 37, I think it was. But there have been a lot of iterations. Sometimes they'll go for a month, sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes 2 months, but gradually we were doing it and getting it right. These regulations came from the advice of the Health Emergency Operating Center, the National Emergency Operating Center, that was made up not now just of medical experts, but also a number of intergovernmental, interministerial department heads and others, their representatives, who spent tireless hours at the center, which was housed at NEMA, to be able to work to protect our people. There were days, maybe weeks, when a number of our public servants slept out of their homes at NEMA. They spent 24 hours there. At the heyday of this advent of the COVID response. When it happened, no one knew what was going to happen. And there was a sudden fear in the country. People were very, very concerned. And at that time, every measure that could have been done to be brought to bear to protect our people was used. And we have to give a lot of credit. The country owes a debt to many individuals who went beyond the call of duty to work to help us. And out of that, those discussions and so on with all the various members of the task force, they all had an input into the iterations of the regulations that now make up this bill. We hear that it has errors. I haven't heard any of the errors. But it's easy to say, oh, it has errors. But I can't answer them because they have not spelled out what the errors were. It's easy to say that. It's a patchwork. They're talking about typesetting, how it's typewritten, but not the content of the document. And this bill, as we say, will be gazetted for the general public. It will be put in the laws of St. Kitts and Nevis, and it will be properly formatted under that circumstances. It in no way affects the content of the various clauses of the bill and the import that they bring to managing the behavior of our people. The member for number 6 raised the question of the state of emergency and how it was during a state of emergency brought on by this Covid-19 pandemic that general elections were called in this country. And I think that he felt duty-bound to make that comment. But it would only have been on the last sitting of this chamber, of this parliament, the very morning of that thing, that I made a statement to this honorable parliament in which I reported on the judgment of the court. Because the member for number 6 was one of 3 claimants that moved the court 1 week before the elections to challenge whether there could be an election with a state of emergency. The challenge whether it was fair, was that it would prejudice the members of the Labour Party. And after months of making representation submissions, the court has spoken unequivocally and said that in no way did it affect them or the ability to have the election. The state of emergency was properly enforced, was necessary for the public health, for good governance, for order of this country. And so I'm somewhat surprised that today the member for number 6 would want to revisit that. The honourable member for number 7, the honourable Prime Minister, dealt with this one in a very forceful manner. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's important to set a little bit more context as we close about where we are today. Because when that proclamation was made by His Excellency, the Governor General, Sir S.W. Tapley Seaton, back in March, April of this year, the borders were closed. And what did the closure of borders mean? It meant that commercial traffic to St. Kitts and Nevis was stopped. People couldn't just jump on a plane and come here. And the reason why that happened was one of the last flights to come into St. Kitts. 2 of our citizens returned home, 2 nationals returned home to St. Kitts. And when they were tested, they found and were diagnosed to have been positive cases of COVID. And it alarmed all of us because anyone could come on a plane, come to St. Kitts and Nevis, and the virus could come on a plane to St. Kitts and Nevis. So we closed the borders and began trial and error, trial to get the protocols right. It did not mean that no plane or vessel came to St. Kitts or Nevis. The shipping lines brought food every week, and there were protocols in place to manage that. The airline cargo ships, cargo, came every week. But no open commercial traffic of passengers came. That was what was meant by the closure of borders. It did not mean, Madam Deputy Speaker, that our nationals didn't come home either, because they could apply to come. And the regulations that were in place allowed for them to apply to the port, to CASPA or NASPA, and that would be then, they would contact the National Task Force. But the ports gave permission for special charters to come. And the charter operators had to identify the individuals in those planes. People came and were quarantined under the regulations, but they also give basis to the Quarantine Act. And we know over the months that we established public quarantine sites for a long time. At OTI, the Royal St. Kitts. In Nevis, there was a Wally, and there's now Potworks as well in Nevis. The borders are now opened. On the 31st of October, we determined that commercial flights could restart in St. Kitts and Nevis. And the Honorable Prime Minister, the member for number 7, in his usual, very erudite self, explained exactly how we got there. Gradually, step by step, as we learn to do things properly, and we're able to control the transmission to stop it from coming in, we were able to gradually open up. And there came a time, some weeks ago, where there was more or less complete opening up within St. Kitts and Nevis. Businesses were open, restrictions about not being able to go all night at functions was removed, and people become complacent. No COVID in St. Kitts, but we have opened up. And with opening up, we are now exposed to the risk of it coming back. And that is why we are now very carefully introducing Schedule 7 and Schedule 8 of this bill that is causing further questions and comments by those from the opposite side. Schedule 7 deals with travel protocols. How do we treat with those returning on a flight? We hear about tourists and how there is this perception that they somehow might have better treatment than returning nationals. And there was a whole song and dance about us having to give a special dispensation to returning nationals, that they don't have to be approved to come.
No, you didn't say that.
But I stand corrected if you didn't say that there was a nuance to it, that we should not let them feel they would not be allowed. And we disagree with you. But let me put to you what our position is, because I think that is very clear. It's been very clear when I read at length the protocols. Anyone returning to St. Kitts and Nevis, whether you be a national or non-national, anyone must fill out a form. They have to fill out a form. Anyone who has a health issue in that they do not have, or they have a positive PCR test, there is an issue that the airline would not allow them on their plane. That is not us. The airline does not allow someone who demonstrates a positive PCR test to get on the flight, because it affects the airline. They have to travel with other people who are not affected. and therefore is so contagious that the airline becomes a problem. And so, every person who fills out the form, we insist that we must see that PCR test too. And that is transmitted back here. So if you're national, your neighbor Springberry here, you've got to do a PCR test. And if you're positive, you're not going to get to come. You cannot get to come. So the idea that somehow we are discriminating against our nationals has never been the position and cannot be the position. I want to make the point further in the clarification. The question has been asked, what actually has been happening? Because we have now had 2 direct flights from Miami to St. Kitts by American Airlines. And the Saturday before, the first Saturday, 106 people had booked for that flight. 106. And so from the Wednesday, Thursday, Friday leading up to that, there is an online form that must be filled out, must be loaded, and questions answered. And if you did not complete that form and did not load the thing, you can't come. What I would tell you is that here at the NEOC, at the task force, we had some 6 to 8 people call every single one of those people to walk them through the form, to get them to take the test and go on. Up to 1 hour before the flight was to close, people were calling from the desk at the airline in Miami and being walked through by the people at the task force. Every assistance is being given by the team that has been working 24/7 to assist anyone, in particular nationals of St. Kitts and Nevis, to assist them to get on a flight. So there should be no perception that anyway that is being made difficult for any Kittitian on a vision to come home. This is where they're born, this is where they're from. They can come. But we say that when they come in, we have to look for the safety and security of our people and the system. And so we ask you, just yesterday, I was talking to one of my colleagues, and he was talking to one guy who was to come on Saturday, gone. He done book his flight, he went and take his test, and Friday night he get a phone call. Boy, I test positive, I can't come. And it is a safety precaution, a measure for us to continue to protect the people of St. Kitts and Nevis. We are under no illusion that we could stop everybody. Some will come, and the virus is likely, unfortunately, to slip through. But we are doing everything in our power to try and mitigate that. We are doing everything in our power to try to ensure that we keep the people of St. Kitts and Nevis safe. And so, when we read these protocols in Schedule 7 and Schedule 8, I was at pains to go through them, is to let our people know that we want them to conform to the rule that we have established. It is for their good, it is for their families' good, it is for the airline, and we want, as much as possible, to keep the people of St. Kitts and Nevis safe. And that is what we intend to do. Yes. And we will work hard to do so. Saturday, we had another flight from American, and the same process went through again. Because in our discussions at Cabinet, we have even asked how much time before the flight leaves should you close off that communication with them. Because the task force people are saying, boy, this hour up to the last hour is sort of very difficult. Can you give us 4 hours? Can you give us 8 hours? So the people come after that time, it's too late. But there is a process for us to interact with everyone who fills out a quarantine form to ensure that they're conforming and everything is in order. And it's important for the people of St. Kitts and Nevis to understand that we are doing this for their safety.
Yes.
Their safety. As it is to the tourists, we understand that tourism had been a major income earner for our country. Many people depend on it. Taxis, bartenders, restaurants, a lot of interconnectivity in the tourism sector. And so we have been, but it has the potential for transmission, as has happened in St. Lucia, as has happened in other places. And so we want to be very, very careful. Hundreds, thousands of people have been trained by the Ministry of Tourism, the Tourism Authority. They're getting training and training and training so that they are well versed in what they do. Taxis have been trained, taxi drivers have been trained so that they know how to operate, sanitize. There have been issues about how to fill out your taxi cab, whether you need a partition between the driver and the passenger. Some thought the expense of it was an issue. But in the end, through consultation and dialogue, the taxis themselves understand, taxi drivers. And so they are being certified to be able to involve in this tourism sector. We are confident that we will work hard to ensure that people in St. Kitts and Nevis are protected. The other question that was raised by the member for number 6, Madam Deputy Speaker, had to do with the concept of this word suffering. Of course, he used it in a different context later on and didn't see anything wrong with it. But I don't know. I have no objection to use the word infected. Okay? If he has infected by, I think it would be something that's more palatable to him. But he might suggest a certain sickness, I don't know. And that might be your object to that. But it is a proper word as well, infected by. If you have caught the virus, you're infected by it. So that's something we might consider. And I think it's section 21, subsection 2 is where the word, huh? I understand. But infected a stigma?
Yeah.
But is infected
Yes.
a stigma? So you have a problem with that as well too?
Yeah.
No, but that's
I don't know what you're going to do then.
that's
Yeah? Madam Deputy Speaker, move on to the next question. And the question was social and physical distancing. And the member for number 6 felt that we should remove the term social, because in everything he looked at was the concept of physical. And I must say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I don't agree with him. And I think that I would want to recommend to the House that we keep the term social. I understand what he means, that if you talk social distancing, it might be sort of pushing people away. But it is a very critical term that has found benefit in the churches, where elderly people go, where the churches themselves on their own have been policing this social distancing within the church.
Yeah.
They establish spots where you sit, how close you can. Some churches themselves did not even open for weeks and weeks and weeks, because they were concerned about their congregation. Some of them put on special services for those senior citizens or the over age who might have been vulnerable. But the social distancing I think is a critical term to use in this fight against the pandemic. Because we go to bars, we go to gyms, we go to sporting events, and studies around the world have found that social gatherings have been the spreader, the super spreader of the pandemic, the transmitter.
Yes.
And the idea is that each of us have to have a personal responsibility to protect ourselves, to protect our families and those around us, our friends. We must be aware and must understand when it's time to leave. When it's time that I don't want to go in that crowd. It's an important non-pharmaceutical tool that we believe that our citizens must understand. Have a sense of a judgment that this particular crowd ain't for me. Let me move away. My grandmother home, I might pick it up from somebody who I don't know about and carry it home and infect my family. Of distancing. Social distancing is not just physical, but also understanding that certain types of events, certain types of crowds, I need to avoid. And so the concept of social distancing is one that is used around the world and is just, in my opinion and our view, as important as the concept of physical distancing. Sports bars and gyms have been known to do transmission of the virus as well. And so we all have to be careful when we're looking at these questions. Entertainment centers and those type of things.
Yeah.
When people go to them, you're taking a risk.
Yeah.
It's an individual risk. You don't want, now that we don't mandate you not to go, but you have to be careful. We are asking people to be careful. And you should understand this. People understand. They're living with it, but asking, what is this about? That, I think, was the phrase I wrote down from you. People understand. If they understand and living with it, they should know how to conduct themselves properly. Wear your mask, sanitize, and avoid large gatherings. There was quite a lot of talk on vaccines, and the Honourable Member for number 7, the Prime Minister, did deal with that adequately, ably, as he normally does. COVAX is a facility where countries around the world pool their resources so that they can adequately provide for the vaccine when it becomes available. And we believe, we hope, that over the next 3 to 6 months, it will become available. And we, therefore, have to mark time, hold strain. We done gone more than 7 months. And we hope that we don't have to wait as long. But we have to be cautious and careful as we go forward. The Prime Minister indicated that it was almost some $800,000 that our country thought that there was a priority for the good of all, that we be in line to get this vaccine. I want to end, Madam Deputy Speaker, by noting that the member for number 6 unequivocally gave his support to the bill, that he recognizes, as I know he would, the critical importance of having a legal framework in place in our country for people to be protected from the ravages of this worldwide pandemic. We want to be able to thank all those who spoke on the bill, who supported it, and we would want it to have safe passage to this Honourable House. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Covid-19 Prevention and Control Bill 2020 is a critical and important bill. We believe it will protect many of our people. We would want it to protect lives, that no one in St. Kitts and Nevis becomes a fatality to COVID. And we want it to be the type of mitigation tool that we are able to reduce, if not protect and prevent anyone from getting the virus. And so I would want to wish a safe passage to this Honorable House, Madam Deputy Speaker. May it please you.
Okay, at this moment, I will ask Mr. Speaker to chair.